Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
I never believed betrayal could literally kill someone until I watched my mother collapse on our kitchen floor after walking in on my father and my aunt together. The scream that escaped her throat wasn't human. It was the sound of a soul breaking in real time. As she clutched her chest and gasped for air, I knew our family was over. Standing there watching paramedics work frantically to restart her heart, while my father straightened his clothes without a trace of shame, I realized I was witnessing the destruction of everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and family. The ambulance sirens faded into the distance, but the image of my mother's face burned into my memory forever. Growing up in suburban Denver, Colorado, I thought we had the perfect family. My name is Dudley, and at 28 years old, I can still remember believing my father, Frank, was a hero. He worked as a construction foreman for Rocky Mountain builders, coming home each evening with calloused hands and stories about building dreams for other families. His broad shoulders and weathered face made him seem invincible to my young eyes. My mother, Susan, taught third grade at Pinecone Elementary School, where she spent 30 years molding young minds with infinite patience. Her gentle voice could calm any upset child, and her homemade apple pies were legendary throughout our neighborhood on Maple Street. Every morning she would pack Frank's lunch with a handwritten note tucked inside, usually something simple, like, "Have a wonderful day, my love," or, "Remember you're my hero." Then there was Aunt Carol, my father's younger sister, who seemed to float through life with effortless charm. She worked as a real estate agent in downtown Denver, always dressed in designer suits and driving the latest model cars. Carol would arrive for holidays bearing expensive gifts and entertaining stories from her glamorous career. She had this infectious laugh that could fill our entire house, and she never missed an opportunity to tell me how proud she was of my accomplishments. After her divorce 2 years ago, Carol claimed she needed family support and moved from Phoenix to a trendy apartment just 20 minutes from our house. She started showing up unannounced for dinner, offering to help with household projects, and spending entire weekends lounging by our pool. Mom welcomed the company, especially since I had moved out after college to start my career as a junior accountant at Mountain View Financial. The first crack in our perfect facade appeared 6 months ago when I noticed changes in my mother's behavior. She seemed constantly anxious, forgetting simple things and complaining about feeling dizzy. Her usually pristine house began showing signs of neglect, with dishes piling up and laundry sitting unfolded. When I asked about it, she brushed off my concerns, claiming she was just tired from teaching. Meanwhile, Carol's visits became more frequent and lengthy. She would arrive early in the morning, supposedly to help Mom with errands, but I noticed they often involved Frank more than Susan. Carol knew his work schedule perfectly, always timing her appearances for when he would be home for lunch or finishing projects in the garage. The day everything shattered started like any other Tuesday. I had left work early to surprise Mom with groceries for her favorite chicken casserole recipe. Walking through the front door, I expected to find her grading papers at the kitchen table. Instead, I heard unfamiliar sounds coming from upstairs. My heart hammered against my ribs as I climbed the familiar wooden staircase, each step echoing like a drumbeat of impending doom. The hallway that once felt warm and welcoming now stretched endlessly before me. When I reached my parents' bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar, the sounds became unmistakably clear. Through the gap, I saw them tangled together on the bed where my mother had slept beside Frank for 32 years. Carol's red dress lay crumpled on the floor next to Frank's work boots. They were so absorbed in their betrayal that they never heard me approach. The confrontation that followed was swift and devastating. Frank showed no shame, no remorse, No recognition that he had destroyed 3 decades of marriage in pursuit of his own selfish desires. Carol smirked as she straightened her hair, as if she had won some twisted competition I never knew existed. But the real devastation came when Mom arrived home 20 minutes later, her arms full of art supplies for her classroom. The sight of Frank and Carol sitting casually on the living room couch, discussing their future together like it was a business transaction, sent her into shock so severe that her heart simply couldn't handle the strain. The climactic twist that still haunts me happened during those frantic moments while paramedics worked to save her life. Frank refused to ride in the ambulance to Presbyterian Hospital, claiming he needed to handle things at home with Carol. As my mother fought for her life in the back of that emergency vehicle, her husband of 3 decades chose his mistress over her survival. Standing in the hospital parking garage later that night, I confronted Frank about his absence from Mom's bedside. His response chilled me to the bone. He looked me straight in the eye and said this was destiny, that he and Carol had found true love and wouldn't let guilt or obligation stand in their way. He spoke about my dying mother as if she were an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a human being whose heart was literally breaking from his betrayal. That night, I realized I wasn't just losing my mother. I was discovering that my father was a stranger capable of cruelty I never imagined possible. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits, legal consultations, and growing suspicions about Carol's true motives. Mom remained in intensive care, her condition fluctuating between stable and critical, while machines monitored her damaged heart. During one particularly difficult afternoon, I found Carol's oversized purse sitting unattended in the hospital cafeteria. Something compelled me to look inside, and what I discovered changed everything. Hidden beneath her makeup and wallet were 3 prescription bottles with my mother's name on them. The medications were for anxiety and high blood pressure, but the dates showed Carol had been picking them up from the pharmacy for the past 2 months. My hands trembled as I photographed the evidence with my phone. Why would Carol be handling Mom's medications? I knew my mother was extremely careful about her prescriptions, always taking them at exact times and never allowing anyone else to manage them. Dr. Martinez's mom's cardiologist was initially reluctant to discuss the medical details with me, citing privacy concerns. However, when I showed him the photos of the pill bottles and explained my suspicions, his expression grew grave. He ordered immediate blood tests to check for medication levels in Mom's system. The results arrived 2 days later and confirmed my worst fears. Mom had dangerously high concentrations of both medications in her bloodstream levels that would have caused exactly the symptoms I had noticed over recent months: confusion, dizziness, weakness, and memory problems. Someone had been deliberately overdosing her for weeks before the affair revelation, systematically weakening her heart and mind. While I grappled with this horrifying discovery, Frank and Carol were busy dismantling the life my parents had built together. They sold Mom's cherished antique dining room set, claiming they needed money for medical expenses. Frank's construction crew began avoiding him after word spread about his behavior at the hospital. Several longtime clients canceled projects, unwilling to work with someone who would abandon his dying wife. Carol moved more of her belongings into our family home each day, transforming spaces that held decades of memories into something unrecognizable. She replaced Mom's family photos with modern art, threw away handmade quilts that took years to complete, and even had the audacity to sleep in my parents' bed while Mom fought for life in room 314 at Presbyterian Hospital. During one of my evening visits to check on Mom, I discovered Frank's hidden correspondence while searching for insurance paperwork in his home office. Buried beneath construction contracts and billing statements, I found a manila folder containing dozens of love letters between Frank and Carol dating back 6 months. The letters revealed a calculated plan that went far beyond a simple affair. Carol wrote about eliminating obstacles and claiming what rightfully belongs to us. Frank responded with detailed plans about selling the house, accessing Mom's teacher retirement fund, and starting fresh somewhere new. They discussed my mother as if she were already dead, dividing her possessions and making arrangements for her funeral. One letter from Carol particularly stood out, written just 2 weeks before I discovered their affair. She detailed how she had been managing Susan's health issues and expressed confidence that nature would soon take its course. The cold calculation in her words made my stomach turn. They hadn't just betrayed my mother. They had tried to murder her slowly and systematically. The final devastating blow came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. I had spent the day consulting with lawyers about the medication evidence when my phone rang with news from the hospital. Mom's condition had deteriorated rapidly during the afternoon, and she was asking for Frank. I raced through rush-hour traffic, desperate to reach Presbyterian Hospital before it was too late. The cardiac unit felt different that evening, filled with an atmosphere of finality that medical professionals recognize long before families accept it. Dr. Martinez met me outside room 314 with compassionate eyes that told me everything I needed to know. Mom had perhaps an hour remaining, and she had been asking for Frank repeatedly throughout the day. I tried calling him 17 times, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails explaining that his wife was dying and needed him immediately. Frank never answered. Carol's car was in our driveway when I drove past the house, and neither of them responded to my frantic messages. I later learned they had gone to dinner at an expensive steakhouse downtown, celebrating what they believed was their imminent freedom. I held Mom's hand as her breathing became more labored, and her heartbeat grew irregular on the monitor. She whispered my name one last time, squeezed my fingers with what little strength remained, and slipped away peacefully, just as the autumn sun disappeared behind the Rocky Mountains. She died alone, except for me, abandoned by the man she had loved faithfully for 32 years, betrayed by the sister-in-law she had welcomed as family, and poisoned by someone she trusted completely. The woman who had dedicated her life to nurturing children and supporting her family deserved so much better than the cruel ending Frank and Carol had orchestrated. Standing beside her hospital bed as the machines fell silent, I made a promise to my mother's memory. Frank and Carol thought they had won, but their victory celebration was about to become their worst nightmare. 3 days after Mom's death, I stood in the parking lot of Riverside Memorial Chapel, watching the most disgusting display of arrogance I had ever witnessed. Frank arrived for his own wife's funeral, wearing a brand new black suit, walking arm in arm with Carol, who had the audacity to dress herself in my mother's favorite pearl necklace and black dress that she had stolen from the closet. The morning air was crisp with early November cold, as mourners gathered to pay their respects to a woman who had touched countless lives through her teaching career. Former students, now grown with children of their own, came to honor the teacher who had shaped their early years. Colleagues from Pinecone Elementary School filled 3 entire rows, many wiping tears, as they remembered Susan's kindness and dedication. But all attention shifted to the front of the chapel when Frank and Carol made their entrance. Carol's red hair was styled in an elaborate updo, and she wore expensive jewelry that everyone recognized as belonging to my mother. The wedding ring on her finger caught the light from the stained glass windows, and I felt sick realizing it was the same ring Frank had placed on Mom's hand 3 decades earlier. During the eulogy portion of the service, I had prepared heartfelt remarks about Mom's legacy as an educator and loving mother. However, before I could reach the podium, Frank stood up and announced he had something important to share with everyone. What followed was the most shocking display of selfishness imaginable. Frank cleared his throat and told the assembled mourners that while he grieved for Susan, life had to continue. He placed his hand on Carol's shoulder and announced that she was expecting twins and that they planned to marry within the month. The chapel fell into stunned silence. Even the funeral director looked horrified by the inappropriate timing of such an announcement. Mom's sister, Margaret, audibly gasped, and several of Susan's teaching colleagues exchanged looks of disgust. But Frank wasn't finished destroying what remained of my mother's memory. He continued his speech by explaining that, as a soon-to-be father again at 53 years old, he needed family support. Looking directly at me, he announced that I would be expected to help financially support the new babies and provide assistance with childcare once they arrived. Carol smiled sweetly throughout this entire performance, occasionally nodding as if she were graciously accepting condolences rather than participating in the desecration of a funeral service. When Frank mentioned their financial needs, she opened her purse and pulled out several official-looking documents. The papers turned out to be a detailed accounting of every dollar Frank claimed to have spent on my upbringing, from diapers and formula to college tuition at the University of Colorado. According to his calculations, I owed them $47,000 for the privilege of being raised in their household. The documents demanded immediate repayment to help support his new family's needs. Several mourners began walking out in disgust, unable to witness such blatant disrespect during a funeral service. Mom's longtime friend Joyce stood up and told Frank he should be ashamed of himself, that Susan deserved better than having her memorial turned into a business transaction. Margaret, Mom's older sister, who had flown in from Portland, confronted Frank directly about his behavior. She pointed out that Susan's body was still warm in the casket while he was already planning his new life. Margaret's voice carried throughout the chapel, as she called him a disgrace to the family name, and promised that Susan's memory would be honored properly despite his actions. The climactic twist that left me reeling came when Frank pulled out additional paperwork from his jacket pocket. These documents showed months of financial transactions that I had never seen before, all bearing what appeared to be my mother's signature. Bank statements revealed that $60,000 had been transferred from Mom's teacher retirement account into new accounts opened by Carol. Frank explained that Susan had agreed to provide financial support for their future together before her death, that she had recognized their true love and wanted to ensure they could care for the coming babies. He showed withdrawal slips and account transfer forms, all dated during the weeks when Mom had been suffering from the medication overdoses that left her confused and disoriented. Carol produced additional papers, showing that she had been granted power of attorney over Susan's finances during her illness, supposedly signed by Mom during one of her hospital stays. With this authority, they had systematically drained accounts that Susan had spent decades building through her teaching salary. The funeral that should have celebrated my mother's life and service instead became a platform for Frank and Carol to announce their theft of her life savings. They stood before 200 mourners and essentially confessed to financial fraud while demanding that I contribute even more money to support their upcoming family. As the service concluded and people filed past the casket to pay their final respects, Frank and Carol positioned themselves near the flowers, as if they were graciously receiving condolences. Carol wore my mother's pearls and wedding ring, while accepting sympathetic hugs from people who had no idea they were consoling the very people responsible for Susan's suffering. Walking out of Riverside Memorial Chapel that day, I realized that Frank and Carol's arrogance would ultimately become their downfall. They had been so confident in their plan that they had openly confessed to their crimes in front of hundreds of witnesses. Their greed and cruelty had been displayed for the entire community to see. But I also understood that they weren't finished with their destruction. The demands for money and childcare support meant they planned to continue controlling and manipulating me indefinitely. They expected me to become their personal bank account, while they enjoyed the life they had stolen from my mother. That evening, as I sat alone in my apartment reviewing the fraudulent documents they had presented, I began planning my response. Frank and Carol thought they held all the cards, but they had made one critical error. They had underestimated their victim's son and they were about to discover that their carefully orchestrated plan had fatal flaws. 2 weeks after the funeral, Frank and Carol executed what they believed was their master stroke. I arrived at my office at Mountain View Financial on a Monday morning to find my supervisor, Mr. Patterson, waiting with a grim expression, and 2 investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. The allegations were devastating and professionally destructive. According to carefully forged documents provided by anonymous sources, I had been embezzling client funds for over 8 months. Bank records showed suspicious transfers from elderly clients' retirement accounts into offshore accounts, allegedly controlled by me. The amounts totaled nearly $90,000, enough to warrant federal charges. Mr. Patterson, a man I had respected and trusted for 3 years, looked genuinely disappointed as he explained that the evidence against me was overwhelming. Client Mrs. Henderson had supposedly discovered discrepancies in her monthly statements and contacted authorities. The investigation revealed a pattern of theft targeting vulnerable seniors who trusted me with their financial planning. Security escorted me from the building while my colleagues watched in shock. My access cards were deactivated, my computer was seized for forensic analysis, and my professional reputation was destroyed within hours. The local news picked up the story that evening, describing me as a young accountant who had betrayed elderly clients' trust for personal gain. What made the setup particularly ingenious was how Carol had orchestrated every detail. Over the previous months, she had been dating Mr. Patterson without anyone at my office knowing about their relationship. Using pillow talk and stolen glimpses at company files during her visits to his apartment, she had learned enough about our client base and procedures to create convincing forgeries. The offshore accounts were opened using identity information stolen from my personnel files. Carol's background in real estate had taught her about financial fraud techniques, and she had applied those skills to create an airtight case against me. Every transaction appeared legitimate on the surface, and the paper trail led directly to accounts bearing my name and social security number. Within 72 hours, my entire life collapsed. Criminal charges were filed, my assets were frozen during the investigation, and my professional license was suspended pending resolution of the case. The legal fees required to defend myself would cost more than I could afford, especially without employment income. Frank called me that Wednesday evening with barely concealed satisfaction in his voice. He explained that since I was obviously facing financial difficulties, I should move back into the family home where Carol could keep an eye on me while I worked minimum wage jobs to pay them rent. They would graciously allow me to help with household expenses and childcare duties once the babies arrived. Carol's pregnancy was progressing smoothly, and her doctor had confirmed she was carrying twins as expected. Frank had already converted my childhood bedroom into a nursery painting, the walls yellow and assembling cribs where my desk and bookshelf had once stood. My trophies and personal belongings had been boxed up and stored in the garage, making room for baby supplies and equipment. The financial trap was perfectly designed to force my compliance with their demands. Unable to afford legal representation or independent housing, I had no choice but to accept their offer of shelter in exchange for labor and financial contribution. They calculated that minimum wage earnings from restaurant work or retail jobs would provide them with steady income while keeping me too exhausted to fight back effectively. Moving back into that house felt like entering a mausoleum dedicated to my mother's memory, but twisted by Frank and Carol's presence. Mom's kitchen had been completely remodeled, with modern appliances purchased using her stolen retirement funds. The living room where she had graded papers and watched television now featured expensive leather furniture and a massive entertainment system. The most emotionally devastating change was in the master bedroom, where Carol had replaced every trace of my mother's existence with her own possessions. Mom's dresser had been sold and replaced with Carol's vanity table covered in expensive cosmetics and jewelry. The walk-in closet that once held 30 years of Mom's teaching clothes now displayed Carol's designer wardrobe organized by color and season. But the climactic moment that broke my heart completely happened 3 weeks after I moved back home. I returned from my new job washing dishes at a downtown restaurant to find Frank and Carol burning my mother's personal belongings in the backyard fire pit. Photo albums from family vacations, handwritten letters from her students crafting projects she had made over the years, and even her collection of educational books were all feeding the flames. Carol laughed as she tossed decades of memories into the fire, claiming they needed to clear space for baby items and create a fresh start for their new family. Frank stood beside her, adding fuel to ensure everything burned completely, including my mother's wedding dress that she had carefully preserved in hopes of passing it down to future generations. I watched 30 years of my mother's life turn to ash, while the people responsible for her death celebrated their freedom from her memory. Carol's jewelry caught the firelight as she danced around the flames wearing my mother's pearls, while destroying everything Susan had treasured. Frank opened a bottle of expensive wine to toast their success in eliminating the last traces of his previous marriage. Standing there in the shadow of our house watching smoke carry away my mother's memories, I realized that Frank and Carol had crossed a line from which there would be no return. They hadn't just stolen money or committed fraud. They had attempted to erase a good woman's entire existence from the world. That night, lying in my childhood bed, surrounded by baby furniture, I began developing a plan that would expose their crimes and restore justice for my mother's memory. Frank and Carol thought they had checkmated me completely, but they had made one crucial mistake. Their arrogance had made them careless, and their cruelty had given me the motivation to destroy them as thoroughly as they had destroyed my family. The war they had started with my mother's murder was about to enter its final phase, and I intended to ensure they learned exactly what happens when you underestimate your victim's son. Working the overnight shift washing dishes at Marco's Italian restaurant provided the perfect cover for my investigation. While Frank and Carol slept comfortably in my mother's bed, I spent my breaks researching their backgrounds using the restaurant's office computer and my smartphone. Margaret, my mother's sister, had driven down from Portland immediately after the funeral and refused to leave Denver until we found answers about Susan's death. She rented a small apartment near the hospital and began her own inquiry into the suspicious circumstances surrounding Mom's final weeks. Together, we pooled our limited resources to hire Jake Thompson, a retired Denver police detective, who now worked as a private investigator. Jake specialized in financial fraud cases and came highly recommended by one of Mom's former teaching colleagues, whose ex-husband had been caught embezzling from their joint accounts. Jake's initial findings were startling, but not surprising. Carol's real name wasn't Carol at all. Her legal identity was Carmen Maria Rodriguez, and she had been married 4 times in the past decade across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. None of those marriages had ended in proper divorces. She simply disappeared when bank accounts were drained and moved on to new victims in different states. The storage unit revelation came during Jake's second week of investigation. Using public records and financial tracking, he discovered that Carol had been renting a large climate-controlled storage facility in Aurora for over 2 years. The unit was registered under her real name and paid for with accounts traced back to previous victims. Margaret and I accompanied Jake when he obtained a warrant to search the storage unit. What we found inside was a museum of stolen lives. Antique furniture, family heirlooms, jewelry collections, and photo albums filled the 10 by 20 space from floor to ceiling. Each item represented another family destroyed by Carol's schemes. Jake identified belongings from at least 6 different households, including complete dining room sets, china collections, and even personal artwork created by children whose families had been targeted. A detailed inventory revealed items worth over $200,000 accumulated through years of marriage fraud and financial manipulation. But the most shocking discovery was a filing cabinet containing meticulous records of Carol's operations. She kept detailed profiles of each target family, including financial information, personal weaknesses, and relationship dynamics that could be exploited. Frank's file dated back 8 months and contained photographs of our house copies of Mom's medical records and personality assessments of every family member. The medical records were particularly damning. Carol had somehow obtained copies of Mom's complete health history, including detailed information about her heart condition and prescription medications. Handwritten notes in the margins showed calculations for dosage increases and timing schedules that matched exactly with the period when Mom's symptoms had worsened. Jake discovered that Carol wasn't working alone. Her previous marriage fraud schemes had involved accomplices who helped with document forgery, identity theft, and money laundering. Phone records showed regular contact with associates in Phoenix and Las Vegas who specialized in creating false identification documents and offshore financial accounts. The pregnancy revelation was perhaps the most disturbing twist of all. Medical records obtained through Jake's law enforcement connections showed that Carol had been pregnant before beginning her relationship with Frank. DNA testing possibilities suggested the twins might belong to her most recent victim in Albuquerque, a widower named Roberto Martinez, who had died of a suspicious heart attack just 2 weeks after marrying Carol. Jake's investigation revealed that Roberto Martinez had been found dead in his home with elevated levels of heart medication in his system, remarkably similar to what had happened to my mother. The Albuquerque police had ruled his death natural, but reviewing the case files showed the same pattern of medication manipulation that Dr. Martinez had identified in Mom's blood work. While gathering this evidence, I maintained my role as Frank and Carol's obedient victim. I washed dishes at Marco's until 3 in the morning, then returned home to help with household chores and listen to their demands for additional financial support. Carol's pregnancy was progressing visibly, and she used her condition to justify increasingly expensive purchases of baby equipment and maternity clothes. Frank's construction business was struggling as word spread throughout the industry about his behavior during Mom's illness and death. Several former clients had filed complaints with the Better Business Bureau, and his longtime business partner was considering ending their professional relationship. The stress was making Frank increasingly volatile and suspicious. Carol sensed that something had changed in my behavior, even though I tried desperately to maintain my facade of defeat and compliance. She began questioning my whereabouts during work hours and demanding to see my paycheck stubs from the restaurant. Her real estate background had taught her to recognize when people were hiding information. The breaking point came when Carol discovered that Margaret was still in Denver and had been staying in contact with me. Frank confronted me in the garage one evening, demanding to know why Mom's sister hadn't returned to Portland after the funeral. His aggression escalated when I couldn't provide satisfactory answers about Margaret's extended visit. During that confrontation, Frank revealed additional details about their future plans that chilled me to the bone. They intended to sell the house immediately after the babies were born and relocate to a state without extradition agreements for financial crimes. Carol had already researched properties in countries that didn't honor U.S. fraud convictions. The stolen retirement money was just the beginning of their scheme. Frank planned to claim life insurance benefits from Mom's death, access her Social Security survivor benefits, and liquidate any remaining assets before disappearing permanently. I was expected to provide them with fake employment references and character testimonials to support their applications for new identities. But Jake's investigation had uncovered enough evidence to support federal charges against both of them. The pattern of interstate marriage fraud, identity theft, and possible murder charges would ensure lengthy prison sentences if we could present our findings properly. Carol's storage unit contents alone constituted evidence of crimes spanning nearly a decade. As Carol's pregnancy entered its final months, I knew our window for action was closing rapidly. Once the babies were born, they would have additional leverage to claim sympathy and complicate any legal proceedings. Frank was becoming increasingly paranoid about outside interference, and Carol's suspicions about my activities were growing stronger each day. The time had come to shift from investigation to action. Margaret, Jake, and I had gathered enough evidence to destroy Frank and Carol's carefully constructed lies, but we needed the perfect moment to strike. They had used my mother's funeral to announce their victory, so I decided their baby shower would become the stage for their public downfall. Carol's baby shower was scheduled for the first Saturday in February at the Mountain View Community Center, the same venue where my parents had celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary just 3 years earlier. Carol had spared no expense in planning what she called Denver's social event of the season, sending engraved invitations to over 60 guests, including Frank's construction crew, her real estate colleagues, neighbors from Maple Street, and even some of Mom's former teaching friends. The irony of holding such a celebration in the same location where my parents had renewed their wedding vows wasn't lost on me. Carol had specifically chosen the venue to demonstrate her complete takeover of my family's social circle and community connections. Margaret flew back from Portland for the occasion officially to support Frank during this difficult transition period following Susan's death. Jake Thompson arranged to attend as Margaret's date, giving him legitimate access to the event and all its attendees. His background in law enforcement had taught him how to blend into social situations while gathering evidence and witness statements. The community center was decorated in soft yellow and green colors with elaborate floral arrangements and a catered buffet that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Carol wore a flowing maternity dress that she claimed cost $800, along with all of my mother's jewelry displayed prominently for everyone to admire. Frank played the role of devoted expectant father, perfectly accepting congratulations from guests who didn't know the truth about how this pregnancy had come about. Several of his construction workers attended reluctantly, still uncomfortable about his treatment of Susan, but unwilling to alienate their foreman completely. The guest list included people whose lives Carol and Frank had touched during their months of deception. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly client whose accounts they had used to frame me for embezzlement, attended because Carol had befriended her during the investigation. Mr. Patterson from my former job came with his new girlfriend, still unaware that his relationship with Carol had been part of an elaborate con game. Carol's real estate colleagues arrived in force, bringing expensive gifts and treating the event like a networking opportunity. These were successful professional women who had no idea they were celebrating with someone whose real name was Carmen Rodriguez and who was wanted for fraud in 3 other states. The gift opening ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock, providing the perfect moment for my planned revelation. Margaret and Jake positioned themselves strategically near the exits, while I prepared the evidence folders that would expose everything Frank and Carol had done. When Carol began unwrapping the elaborate presents, I approached the front of the room, carrying what appeared to be an oversized gift box tied with yellow ribbon. Frank looked pleased, probably assuming I was finally accepting my role in their twisted family dynamic. Instead of baby clothes or nursery decorations, my gift contained copies of every piece of evidence Jake had gathered during his investigation. Marriage certificates showing Carol's 4 previous bigamous marriages, photographs from the storage unit displaying stolen family heirlooms, bank records, documenting the theft of Mom's retirement money, and medical reports, proving she had been systematically poisoning my mother. The room fell silent as I distributed copies of the documentation to every guest. Carol's face turned white as people began reading about her real identity and criminal background. Frank attempted to dismiss the papers as fake, but Jake stood up and identified himself as a licensed private investigator who could authenticate every document. Mrs. Henderson gasped audibly when she realized she had been manipulated into providing false testimony against me. The bank records clearly showed that her accounts had never been touched, and that the entire embezzlement case had been fabricated using forged documents bearing her signature. Mr. Patterson's reaction was particularly satisfying to witness. As he read through the evidence of how Carol had seduced him to gain inside information about Mountain View Financial's clients and procedures, his face turned red with embarrassment and rage. He immediately called his office to report the fraud and begin procedures to clear my professional reputation. Frank's construction crew members began standing up and walking toward the exits as they absorbed the full scope of his deception. His business partner, Tom Bradley, announced loudly that their professional relationship was terminated immediately. Several clients pulled out their phones to contact lawyers about potential lawsuits. Carol's real estate colleagues were equally quick to distance themselves from the scandal. Her supervising broker publicly revoked her license and promised to report her to state authorities for investigation. The luxury lifestyle she had built on stolen money was evaporating before her eyes. The climactic moment came when Carol tried to salvage the situation by claiming the evidence was fabricated by jealous family members who couldn't accept Frank's happiness. She stood up dramatically, placing her hands on her pregnant belly, and appealed to the guests' sympathy by portraying herself as the victim of a vicious campaign. Jake responded by playing audio recordings of conversations between Frank and Carol that I had secretly captured during my weeks living in their house. The recordings included detailed discussions of their plans to murder my mother, slowly using medication overdoses, their schemes to steal her retirement savings, and their intentions to disappear with the money once the babies were born. The room erupted in shocked gasps and angry murmurs as people heard Frank and Carol casually discussing Susan's death as if it were a business transaction. Carol's voice on the recordings expressed no remorse about poisoning a woman who had welcomed her as family, only satisfaction that their plan was working effectively. Frank finally lost his composure completely and lunged toward me, screaming accusations and threats. His own construction workers restrained him, several expressing disgust at learning the truth about their employer's character. The man who had once seemed like a respected community leader now appeared as the desperate criminal he had always been. Carol's stress-induced medical emergency provided the final dramatic element to complete their public humiliation. The combination of exposed lies, destroyed reputation, and lost financial security caused severe complications with her pregnancy. Paramedics arrived to transport her to Presbyterian Hospital, the same facility where my mother had died alone, while Frank celebrated his freedom. As the community center emptied and former friends avoided eye contact with Frank and Carol, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that justice was finally being served. These people had destroyed my mother's life and stolen her memory, but their own greed and arrogance had provided the tools for their downfall. The baby shower that was supposed to celebrate their victory instead became the public revelation of their crimes. Every person who attended would spread the story throughout Denver's interconnected communities, ensuring that Frank and Carol would never again be able to hide behind false identities and manipulated sympathy. But this public humiliation was only the beginning of their consequences. The evidence Jake had gathered would support federal criminal charges, and the witness statements from the baby shower would provide additional testimony for prosecution. Frank and Carol's carefully planned escape was about to become a one-way journey to federal prison. The federal charges came down like an avalanche just 2 weeks after the baby shower revelation. The FBI had been investigating Carol's interstate fraud schemes for over a year, and Jake's evidence provided the missing pieces they needed to build an airtight case against both her and Frank. Carol, whose real name, Carmen Rodriguez, was finally used in all official documents, faced 17 federal counts, including mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, bigamy, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence from her storage unit connected her to crimes across 4 states spanning nearly a decade, with total damages exceeding $400,000. Frank's charges were equally devastating. As Carol's accomplice in my mother's murder and the theft of her retirement funds, he faced federal conspiracy charges accessory to murder and fraud counts that carried mandatory minimum sentences. The recordings I had captured of their conversations provided prosecutors with clear evidence of their criminal intent and callous disregard for human life. The pregnancy complications Carol experienced during the baby shower stress had tragic consequences that ultimately sealed their fate. She lost both twins during her 5th day in federal custody, ending their scheme permanently and eliminating their last hope for sympathy during sentencing. The medical examiner's report confirmed that the babies had not been Frank's children, but rather belonged to Roberto Martinez Carol's previous victim, who had died under suspicious circumstances in Albuquerque. Frank's construction business collapsed completely within 30 days of his arrest. Tom Bradley, his former partner, filed a civil lawsuit to recover money stolen from their joint accounts, and the company's assets were seized to pay outstanding debts to clients and subcontractors. The reputation Frank had spent 20 years building in Denver's construction industry was destroyed overnight. My own legal vindication came swiftly once the truth emerged. The embezzlement charges were dropped immediately, and Mountain View Financial offered me not only my old job back, but a promotion to senior accountant with a 20% salary increase. Mr. Patterson was fired for accepting bribes and allowing his personal relationship with Carol to compromise client security. Dr. Martinez provided crucial testimony about Mom's medical records that confirmed she had been systematically poisoned over several weeks before her death. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation reclassified her death from natural causes to homicide, adding murder charges to Frank and Carol's growing list of federal crimes. The financial recovery process took several months, but ultimately I was able to reclaim most of my mother's stolen retirement money. The court ordered Frank and Carol to pay full restitution to all victims, including interest and penalties, that brought the total amount to over $60,000 just for Mom's accounts alone. I used a portion of the recovered money to establish the Susan Mitchell Memorial Scholarship at Pinecone Elementary School, where Mom had taught for 30 years. The scholarship provides funding for classroom supplies and educational materials for teachers working with low-income students, ensuring that Mom's legacy of nurturing young minds would continue long after her death. The family home on Maple Street held too many painful memories for me to continue living there, so I decided to sell it and make a fresh start somewhere new. Before the sale, I carefully removed all of Mom's remaining personal belongings that Frank and Carol hadn't destroyed, including family photo albums they had hidden rather than burned. Margaret helped me organize a proper memorial service for Mom at the same church where she had volunteered for community service projects throughout her teaching career. Over 300 people attended, including former students whose lives she had influenced, teaching colleagues who remembered her dedication, and community members who appreciated her contributions to local charities. Boulder, Colorado became my new home, offering both career advancement opportunities and enough distance from Denver to escape the constant reminders of Frank and Carol's betrayal. The University of Colorado offered continuing education programs that allowed me to expand my accounting credentials while working for a sustainable energy company that aligned with my values. The trial proceedings stretched over 8 months, but the outcomes exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Carol was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, without possibility of parole, ensuring she would never again have the opportunity to target innocent families. Her elaborate schemes had finally caught up with her, and the pattern of destroyed lives would end permanently. Frank received an 18-year sentence for his role in Mom's murder and the subsequent fraud schemes. The judge specifically noted his betrayal of family trust and abandonment of his dying wife as aggravating factors that warranted the maximum possible sentence. He would be 71 years old before becoming eligible for release. Both were ordered to pay complete restitution to all victims identified during the investigation, including families in Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico, whose lives had been shattered by Carol's previous fraud schemes. The total amount exceeded $700,000, money they would never possess, but debts that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Their mugshots appeared in newspapers across the western United States as law enforcement agencies warned other communities about marriage fraud schemes targeting vulnerable widows and widowers. The publicity helped identify additional victims and provided closure for families who had never understood what happened to their missing relatives. Margaret and I maintained regular contact with our shared grief over Mom's death, evolving into a strong family bond that provided support and healing for both of us. She visited Boulder several times throughout the year, and we established new holiday traditions that honored Mom's memory while building positive associations to replace the painful ones. My work with fraud victims expanded beyond my initial desire for justice into a genuine calling to help other families recover from similar betrayals. I began volunteering with legal aid organizations that assist elderly victims of financial fraud, using my accounting background and personal experience to help prosecutors build stronger cases. The emotional healing process took longer than the legal proceedings, but gradually the anger and pain gave way to acceptance and peace. Mom's death had been senseless and cruel, but the justice system had ultimately held her killers accountable for their crimes. Frank and Carol would spend the best years of their remaining lives in federal prison, while I was free to build a life that honored everything Mom had taught me about integrity and compassion. Standing in my new Boulder apartment on the first anniversary of Mom's death, I reflected on the lessons this horrific experience had taught me. Family isn't defined by blood relationships alone, but by the people who demonstrate genuine love and loyalty during life's most difficult moments. Margaret, Jake, Dr. Martinez, and even some of Frank's former construction workers had shown more family commitment than my own father. True justice isn't just about punishment for criminals, but about ensuring their victims are remembered with dignity and their legacies continue to make positive impacts in the world. The scholarship in Mom's name would help hundreds of children receive better educations over the coming decades, creating ripple effects of positive change that Frank and Carol's cruelty could never destroy. Most importantly, I learned that good people must stand together against deception and betrayal, even when the criminals seem to hold all the advantages. Frank and Carol's arrogance had made them believe they were untouchable, but their own evil actions provided the evidence needed to bring them down. As I finish sharing this story, I want to ask you something important. Have you ever encountered people who seemed to have everything figured out on the surface, but whose actions revealed a much darker truth underneath? Family betrayal can happen to anyone, and recognizing the warning signs might help protect someone you care about. Please share your thoughts in the comments below about how we can better support each other through difficult family situations. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video to help others find it who might need to hear this message. Consider subscribing to hear more stories about overcoming betrayal and finding justice when life seems unfair. And please share this with someone who might benefit from knowing they're not alone in facing family challenges. Thank you for listening to my story and allowing me to honor my mother's memory by sharing the truth about what happened to her. I hope her legacy reminds us all to choose loyalty over selfishness, truth over convenience, and love over cruelty in our own relationships. May we all be the kind of family members that Susan Mitchell was, and may we never forget that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still prevail when good people refuse to give up.